I think that I need to bring up the point that I now own, I think, the first 5 books in the Little Blue Truck series, 1 to 5, straight through. So, saying something.
Welcome to Keep It Fictional, a weekly podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Build your to-be-read list with Sadie, Liz, Virginia, Fiona, and Corrine from the Port Moody Public Library. Warning, this podcast contains strong opinions and may cause an increase in your library holds list.
827 book recommendations. 8 book friends and hosts, 3 years, I think, and possibly 149, probably more arguments and debates later. Here we are on our 150th episode of Keep It Fictional. Thank you so much for tuning in to this very special anniversary episode of Keep It Fictional from the Port Moody Public Library. I'm Virginia. Here with me today in the room is Elle and Sadie and Corrine. And I think for today, appearing in spirit and in our hearts are all our past book friends, Gabriel and Mark and Liz and Fiona. And without them, I don't think Keep It Fictional will be complete. I think a couple of episodes ago when Corrine said, it's been 3 years, I'm like, wow, it's been 3 years. That is a good chunk of time. And 150 episodes is quite a lot. And I know I am, and I'm sure my book friends are too, really grateful to have this opportunity every week to talk about books with you listeners. And I feel like this book chat really anchors me. I don't know what I do in the rest of the week, but every Friday at 9 a.m., I know where I'm supposed to be, is here to record this book track. And I am so thankful for all the book suggestions from my book friends and a chance to get to know all of you from your book choices, but also from all the random things that came out of our mouth, I think. And probably a chance to know ourselves too from all the existential questions that we have asked ourselves. I don't think many of these things will come up if we didn't do this podcast, and I wouldn't get to know all of you as much. I didn't know that there's so many, I should know that there's so many Les Mis fans out there. Like we have 3 of them on this show out of the 8. I didn't know that there was such visceral reactions to words like fruiting bodies, or people don't like to read deco edge books, or that there is a problem with owning not book 1 in the series. Or authors describing people eye color is a no-no. I didn't know that that's a thing. I didn't know that people can just put down a book anywhere rather than at the end of the chapter. What is that all about? So many revelations. I'm going to ask my book friends, anything that came to mind, out of these 3 years that you're like, I didn't realize?
Oh, it's absolutely the thing that I was screaming about. I don't know if the microphone caught up, but when Virginia said that some people don't own the first book in the series and they just straight go into book 2 or book 3, wherever they happen to start purchasing of that, that is a shock that I truly feel like I have never recovered from. I look at, and I'm not pointing any fingers, I look at Sadie and Virginia as different people now. I don't have the same amount of respect for them that I used to have. It was such a shocking revelation. I can't even talk about it. I'm so upset. So yeah, that was the big one. It honestly just never occurred to me that such a thing. Fine, you can start with book 1, book 2, book 3, and then if you peter out with the series, that's totally fine. But to just start in the middle, like a psychopath, it haunts me.
I would never start reading the series in the middle. I've always read the first book. It's just sometimes I borrow from the library and then I get the second book as a gift because I like the series. And I think that I need to bring up the point that I now own, I think, the first 5 books in the Little Blue Truck series, 1 to 5, straight through. So saying something. I'm teaching my daughter better ways than and myself.
Al, anything in the short, like, you're fairly new to this podcast. Anything?
Yeah, I was going to say I'm fairly new to the podcast, so I don't think I have had as many earth-shaking revelations as everyone else here. I think for me, one of the big ones was in my introductory episode, learning that some people can read while listening to music with lyrics. I'm sorry, I can't do it. I think that is an amazing skill. I wish I could do it, but I can't.
Well, I mean, even more amazing is that she can also read a book while listening to a podcast.
Yeah, that blows my mind.
It's not that hard. You just split your brain in two and then you do both.
Yeah. So don't worry, there's going to be plenty more time, going to be many more shocking revelations about everybody else and also about yourself. I feel like sometimes we learn a lot about ourselves here too. So yes, so for our 150th episode, I think we want to get up close and personal once again. We're going to take a trip down memory lane to go back to the books that made us who we are as a reader, or maybe even as a person. Books that we fondly remember as our favorite book, books that are formative, books that are influential, whatever way that my book friends are going to interpret this theme, because it's 150 episode. They can do whatever they want. So yeah, so I will start with my 10. My reading life probably is a lot more condensed than my book friends because, as mentioned before, I didn't really have access to books for the first 15 years of my life. And then when I came to Canada, yeah, books are physically available, but are not accessible to me because my English is not quite good enough to read them. And then, of course, school, university, you do a lot of assigned reading. You don't really get to read for fun, so to speak. And then when I finally became a librarian, I spent more than 10 years exclusively reading kids and teens books because I was a children's librarian. And I felt like I had lots to catch up on because I didn't grow up with these books. And I felt like because I was buying books for the library, I really should do the right thing and read as much as I can so I can do a good job. So yeah, didn't really get into sort of that outer world for quite a while. But I think in terms of developing my own kind of reading taste, it was really in the last sort of 10 years or so. So for my 10 books, I ended up picking books that I think were responsible for setting me off in a different reading path and introducing me to a corner of literature that I have not explored before. They're not necessarily my favorite books, but they may explain who I am today. And I think where it all begins has to be the first book that I borrowed from the public library. And I think Sadie was the only one who was here for that episode when I talked about this. But this is a book that I discovered in a paperback spinner at the Collingwood branch of the Vancouver Public Library. If you know, Collingwood branch is a teeny tiny branch. It's like a portable, but that place was magical to me when I first went in because I didn't realize it just feels like there was so many books there, even though there wasn't, but there were so many books. And they were all books I can take home and borrow. That is amazing. And on the paperback spinner is this book. And I think it's the first book that I borrowed sort of on my own. I think it's the reason why I love libraries, the reason why I'm here working in a library. And it is my first introduction to popular reading. It planted that seed of my love for the horror genre. And I think it's also responsible, as I mentioned before, of me improving my English because I read this book, then read a few more by the same author, came back from vacation, and my English teacher in grade 12 asked me, what did you do over the summer? Because your writing was a little bit better. And I'm like, I read. And I'm sure she was a little bit shocked at what I read because all of this is all thanks to a demonic sentient car named Christine, created by Stephen King. And I don't really know, now that I reread it a little bit, I don't know what I actually got out of this book all those years ago. But apparently this is what I got drawn into and I loved it and read a whole bunch of Stephen King. So even though I don't read as much Stephen King these days, I think I will forever be grateful to him for introducing me to libraries, to introducing me to books. So he'll always be special. University, yes, a lot of assigned reading, but doesn't mean that they're not fun. I think my most intense reading time was probably my first year at UBC in the Arts One program. It's kind of like this multidisciplinary program where you get credits for English, philosophy, and history. And how that I think about it, it feels very much like a book club because you got a very small cohort and then you get assigned a reading list, you come to lectures, you do discussions, and then you write an essay for each book. So it is really kind of like a book club. And it was actually a lot of fun. A lot of books that are kind of great thinkers that I would probably never pick up. I think we read Karl Marx, we read Adam Smith, Hobbes and St. Augustine and Plato, and then later on Selfish Gene, and I think Second Sex, I think we read, and then Annie Dillard, all the books that I probably would never have read now. But the book that introduced me to a whole other world of literature is Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. I think before that, for me, it was very much like English literature. That's kind of all I know, the classics. But that was the beginning of my love for translated works. And I remember this is time before the internet. So remember going to a lot of old bookstore trying to like find random books. And of course, at that point, like still very extremely white, very extremely dead, but a lot of different authors that I kind of discovered because of Dostoevsky. And yeah, so I have this like long reading list and bought a lot of like random used books that I have actually never actually read, but more on that a little bit later. In my kids' librarian years, I think that was the period that really started my random banana pants years. I think that was when I decided that I love weird, absurd books, because in kids' books, there are actually a lot of books that are very weird, very wild. And I think sometimes it's a shame that people think, oh, it's a kid's book, it's not for me. But like there's so much fun in them and a lot of humor. And what I was drawn to, of course, is sort of the ones that has more like satirical parodies, very self-deprecating, and just like twisted humor. And I think this is the period of time and all the books that I read during this really prepare me for later on reading like Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett. And so especially drawn to a lot of kids' books by British author, the Philip Adair's Eddie Dickens series, the Mr. Gum series by Andy Stanton. These are probably not very well known, but I love them because they are so weird. Also, first experience of China Miéville in a teen book, which is Unlondon, which I love. Again, a different kind of weirdness there. But I think if I have to pick one book out of all those 10 years, it's probably going to be Perils in Peril series by M.T. Anderson. This is unlike other M.T. Anderson books. You can tell from probably the cover that it's very much like a nostalgic kind of parody of like, your Nancy Drew, your Hardy Boys book. And yeah, it's got Wells on stilts with laser beam eyes. I mean, what more do you want? So yeah, so that was sort of what kind of started the banana pants for me. When I finally decided that to venture into the adult book world, again, thanks to the library where you can explore so many different kinds of books for free, I went into the fantasy section. And I remember browsing through and I was drawn to a certain wizard who is also a detective and a talking skull named Bob. And something about a story that is set in our world but has magic and we're living alongside supernatural beings but we don't know it was really, really appealing to me. And I know, Corinne, I'm so sorry. I'm pretty sure I just randomly picked one from the series. I am sure I did not start from book one, but I did buy it. I did buy book one. I started from book one. So maybe I have redeemed myself. So this is the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. And after reading this, I remember looking for books that our reader likes, the ones with all the taglines like "Move over, Harry Dresden, there's a new wizard in town," like those type of books. So a lot of urban fantasy that I read for a very long time. And it really begins my love for fantasy, even though that's not my subgenre of choice anymore, but it was what started it all. And I think it's the idea of a genre mashup that really, really appeals to me. Harry Dresden is not the only Harry, really, that played a role in my reading life. There's another Harry that also plays a big chunk of my time reading. I went through a period where I read a lot of mysteries and thrillers, specifically during the time when I was really kind of obsessed with Japan. So I watched a lot of Japanese drama and also read a lot of Japanese mystery, but also a lot of, because that was the thing at that time, Nordic Scandinavian police procedurals. I don't know what it is about police procedurals, but I love them. I just love the grunt work of really boring, like going from house to house to interview people. I love it. And maybe Scandinavian, Nordic, probably because they're always in some place cold. Maybe that's why it also appeals to me. But the first book that I read was the Harry Ho series, The Snowman by Yu Nesba. This is what sort of started it all. And I think it kind of took me to the dark side because all these books are very dark, very grim. And I think that was what I really, really love. My tolerance and my capacity for darkness, I really got trained by these books. And I think it also influenced my reading in fantasy because I did a lot of grim, dark fantasy at that point also. I felt like at this point, I've kind of left that mystery thriller behind. I don't know, just don't feel like reading them, but maybe one day I'll get back to them. But a genre that I did not leave behind is horror. Now, I think at this iteration of Keep It Fictional, I think all of us here are genre readers, and you can tell sometimes there's just frustration as a genre reader when people think that your genre of choice is like these stereotypes, right? And I think horror suffers a lot from that. People always think it's like, oh, it's just blood and gore and body parts and gross and disgusting. And is there books like that? Absolutely. But that's not all there is. Like I said, most of these books that I talk about, maybe not my favorite, but this one probably is going to be up there. It's a book that taught me that horror works on many, many different levels. You don't have to see something for it to be scary. And so one of my favorite sort of horror books is The Caretaker of Lawnfield by Dave Selsterman. I love, love, love this book. I think this is also a book that makes me realize what horror can do, what a genre novel can do, but also like the fact that it's ambiguous. I realize how much I love ambiguity. I don't care that it has logic, that has go from point A to point B. I love the ambiguous of everything throughout the book, the unreliable narrator where you don't really know something is real or whether it's in the head, that play on their point of view, and ambiguous ending where I get to decide what I think happens. I love that type of books. For the next 4 books, they are books that I have either talked about or alluded to on this book chat because just like Fiona mentioned on their last episode, a lot of growing up happened because of this book chat in the last few years. I think it took me to many directions beyond what I already read. And every week when I look for books for the topic, I read 1 or 2 and then ended up having another 5 that get on my TBR because there's just so many great books out there. And it really took me to discovering a lot of weird books that I didn't think I would read. And I think really the pandemic also, because I kind of retreated to books to find comfort. And so I think it was really the last few years that really got me to develop a much more consistent kind of reading habit. And having book friends that love books also, of course, made me want to become a better reader. If there's one person who's responsible for a lot of my reading choices in the past couple of years, it's probably Megan McDowell. I've talked about her many times. She's a translator of books written in Spanish, a Booker Prize winning translator. And it's not just her amazing translation, but just for whatever reason, the books that she chose to translate are always books that are right up my alley. And the first book that I read that was translated by her and also started my love for Latin American literature is Multiple Choice by Alejandro Zambra. I love this book so much. It combines my love for unconventional, weird, experimental format because this book, as the title suggested, is all in multiple choices. And also my kind of weird obsession about stories about people living under a dictatorship, and everything just kind of fits, and it came to me at the right time, and it opens up a whole new world of translated work for me. I never really read a lot of books written in Spanish originally, so this really opens up a lot for me. It's just a whole brand new world, so it's another one of my very important book. Weirdly, Megan McDowell also is responsible for the next book, but this next book is a book that made me appreciate a format that I have never appreciated before, which is short stories. I didn't understand short stories prior to this. And I blame on the fact that I was reading anthologies and they just don't work for me because I find it really hard to switch between stories when I have to get to know a whole new author's voice, a whole new writing style. I didn't like it. And because, anthology, there's always stories that you really like. And then there's ones that are like, so like the whole collection always end up being like kind of mediocre. But I realized the right way for me, at least, to read short stories is to read a collection by a single author, because much more than a novel, I feel like I get to know the author so much better because if the author has a strong, distinctive voice, it shows through all the story. And even though when they're playing with different styles and different genres, it's still them. That signature really carries through, the voice carries through. And I think that is the magic of short story. And I was very, very, very lucky that the first one that I got into because of Megan McDowell was The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez. And it was just this masterful piece of work. And I think I was very lucky to find that as my first one because it is really one of the best. And again, thanks to Megan for introducing me to that. But I think that book also shows me and sort of opens up another world that I have never really gone into, which is narratives that explore what it really means to be a girl, to be a woman in this world. It led me to reading a lot of other books because of that. And what Mariana Enriquez does so well is that rawness, that unflinching narrative. She talks about things that you're not supposed to talk about, especially as a woman. And I think it really kind of challenged those norms. And I just love her story so much. And I think it really opens up a different world for me. All right, for book number 9, Corinne, cover your ears for the next couple of minutes. I don't want you to pass out in anger. This book kind of rekindles my love for the weird and the surreal literature that I discovered way, way, way back in university. That whole big pile of books that I wasn't ready to read yet, but I know I like it somehow, but just not quite ready to tackle it. But it inspired me, this book inspired me to go back and read all those authors that I have not read yet. I really need to go back to my mom's house and see if I can still find those books because they're all there, I think. And I think a lot of times books made a difference in our lives because they landed in our lap at the right time. And I think this book came at the perfect time. I was having a bit of a reading slump, not because I wasn't reading, I was reading, but just nothing grabs me. Like I wanted books that to like make me feel like, oh, I love books, like they're so amazing. But nothing was like that. And this book came to my rescue. It reminds me of how books there's still room for something different, something new, something that I've not seen before. And I was so energized, so inspired because of how inventive this book is. And I read this book in February, and then a month later, Mark joined us on our Keep It Fictional book chat, and it was one of his top 10 books that he shared with us. And I think his reading choices for this show really inspired me to explore the lesser known, underappreciated books in translation, but also all the well-known ones. And it's all really timing. So yes, I do have to give a spot to this book as a tribute to a good book friend. And yes, Corinne, it is your hated Gift on a Winter's Night, A Traveler by Italo Calvino, translated by William Weaver. I think I'm going to reread it, even though I don't reread, but I'm scared because I don't know if the magic going to still remains. I guess I'll find out. But I read a bunch of Calvino books since then. I have really, really enjoyed them. So yeah, so I think this should be okay. But I'm looking forward to sort of tackling this again because I think the first time I was just like, wow, this is amazing. Last but not least, my final book. No Keep It Fictional anniversary episode can be complete without me mentioning this author and this book once again. The book that got the elusive 5 stars from all 5 original Keep It Fictional members. The book that I actually reread, even though I never reread books. It is, of course, Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. I think I've talked enough about how amazing, how brilliant this book is, so I'm not going to go there. But personally, it's probably one of the most important books to me because it gives me permission really to explore what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to be a person of color living in North America. It really supported that exploration. I think before that, as someone who came to Canada as a teenager, you're like feeling all the peer pressure, you want to fit in. And so I remember like trying my best to be Canadian, whatever that means, and trying to like abandon everything that who I am and, just like to try to like fit in, right? So that you feel like you belong. And I think it's many, many, many years later, really, really took this book for me to start to kind of really think about where I am, who I am, and sort of navigating the two worlds, the two cultures. There's a lot of microaggressions, a lot of racism that I probably did not see before. And what this does to a person, you're feeling that you're not good enough, that you're always inferior, you're always like, you're never going to belong. And just sort of what that all means and what this world is like, I think, and what is my place in here. And it really, really like, it's a book that started all that kind of examination, I guess. And I have to say also, really thankful for all my book friends here because it's really all of you who supported that journey because all of you have been such amazing, not just book friends, but just friends in general. 10 books. Phew, okay. Yeah, all right. Who wants to go next? Oh, I'm glad I did it first because then I can now just sit back and relax and listen to all of your book journey. So, Sadie?
Okay, I'm ready for this. When we were trying to put together this list, I thought a lot about kind of the balance of not necessarily the books that I was talking about, but the time that I read the books and trying to figure out how much of the books I read as a child I wanted to talk about and trying to figure out if they actually impacted the reader that I am today or if it's more the books that I read as an adult that kind of helped me to become the reader that I am today. But I did kind of split it 50-50. And so I'm going to start with a book that I read over and over and over and over again. Now, if you've listened to this podcast, you know that I am one of those people who is on the no side of rereading books. I do not tend to reread books. There are very few in my life that I have reread, but this is one that every year I would go back to this book. So there were many years as a child, long after I technically grew out of the age range that this book was supposed to be geared towards. I would go back and I would read this book every year, every Christmas. I would read this book. Now, many people I think have heard of Sweet Valley High and maybe Sweet Valley Teen or Sweet Valley Twins. I think the middle one was maybe just called. But I don't know if as many people have heard of Sweet Valley Kids. So Sweet Valley Kids is the beginning of that story. I do believe it was actually written after Sweet Valley High was put out. So Francine Pascal, who wrote these series about two twin sisters, Jessica and Elizabeth, and Sweet Valley Kids is, as it says, it's when they are kids. And so I loved the series. I absolutely loved the series. I always hesitate to say this, but Fiona said this on the podcast, so I'm going to be inspired by them to admit to this. I did not read when I was a kid. I hardly ever read as a child. My parents would get us books for Christmas every single year. We'd get books for our birthday every single year. Quite often those books would go unread in a lot of years. Not that I didn't enjoy reading, it just wasn't what I wanted to spend my time doing at that time. But this book and this series was one that I absolutely loved and I did read. So the book that I'm going to talk about or mention, it's a very bad cover because you cannot find the cover anywhere. Even the Goodreads cover picture is so blurry that I imagine someone just took a picture on their probably digital camera and uploaded it. So this is Sweet Valley Kids Trapped in Toyland. Now, I'm going to do a very brief premise of this book because it is every child's dream. The kids, they get stuck in the mall overnight. They're there doing Christmas shopping and they somehow find out that they have been locked in the mall and they have to figure out how to get out of the mall overnight. I think there's probably someone else locked in there with them that they're trying to escape from. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've read it. But I would read that book every single Christmas. Every single year was like my tradition. There was that one, and I feel like there was one other one that I don't remember anymore. But every single Christmas, I read Sweet Valley Kids Trapped in Toyland. So I feel like that was one of the first books that I really liked, and I kind of realized on my own that I liked it enough that I wanted to keep reading it and go back to it every year. And it was kind of a big thing for me. And I always would usually read it in like a night, and it would always be like my Christmas Eve book. I would just like sit down in bed and read my Christmas Eve book. So yes, so that's Sweet Valley Kids Trapped in Toyland. The next one that inspired me was one of the ones that was bought for me for Christmas by my parents. And I don't think that it's the kind of book that I would ever pick up now. I think that it's a bit too sad for my tastes. I don't tend to read a lot of sad books, but this one, it involved a young tween, I think maybe, who went back to her mom's home from where her mom grew up with her mom and kind of started to learn about her mom's past and learn about her dad. And through this trip, she also meets another child who has cancer. And it's kind of the story of their connection and what she learns about her family and what she learns about herself and kind of how she learns about illness and she learns kind of about these things in life that she'd never had to experience before. And so this is Janie's Girl by Gail Friesen. And I don't know exactly what it was about this book, but I absolutely loved it. And it was another one where I think I reread it a few times when I was a kid. And I think it was in the story, Janie has a lot of freedom kind of to go and explore this town that she's in and this place that she's in. And I think I connected to that because I think I read it at the age where I was really wanting to find that kind of independence in my own life. And so I think that I latched onto that. The side of the story that deals with the kid who has cancer, I could not relate to. I luckily did not have anyone in my life who experienced that as a kid. But there was just, there's something about the story, something about the character that I really enjoyed. And so I think that was one that I still have the book. I really wanted to bring the book, but it is also, as many of my books are right now, in a box in a storage closet. It's moved out of Evie's room when she was born. So I wasn't able to dig through the closet to find it, but it's probably one that I will go back to at some point and reread because yeah, there was just something about it when I read it as a teen that I really, really connected with. So I think that was definitely one that impacted my wanting to keep reading. And I think it inspired me to kind of keep looking for books that I would connect with. Like I said, it was kind of the first one of those ones that my parents bought that I kind of latched onto. So the next one is one that a lot of people know of. And I will say a very controversial thing about this is I loved the book and the movie, but I look at them as two very different pieces of work. So this is Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine. I loved the movie. But I do not think of it as an adaptation of the book. I think of it as a completely separate piece. It has Anne Hathaway and it's a musical. How can I not love it? It is absolutely ridiculous. It has, oh my gosh, what is his name? Wesley from Princess Bride. Yeah, thank you. Carrie Elwes. Kareen, I feel like you are.
I'm so upset with you right now.
I know. I'm okay with that. But yes, Ella Enchanted is, as I'm sure many people know, the story of the young girl who, as a baby, was gifted or cursed with the gift of obedience. And so no matter what, if somebody tells her to do something, she has to do it. And it is the story of how she figures out how to break out of that curse. And yeah, I think it was the first time, the reason that this book is on my list is I think it was the first time that I started to find my genre of book as a kid. And I knew like things that I'd watched and things like that. I always enjoyed fantasy and I always enjoyed kind of fairy tales. But I think this is the first time where I found a book where I'm like, this is what I like to read. This is what I really, really like to read. And this is the genre I like to read. And these are the kinds of stories I like to read. And so, yeah, so this is definitely one that impacted, I think, my future reading. It was kind of that first foray into more fantasy fiction that I learned as a kid, like, this is it. And then, yes, I am sorry. I was so excited when the movie came out because I loved the book and I reread the book and I was super excited to see the movie. And at first I'm like, okay, this is not the book in any way. This is not the book. And I think that's why I can enjoy it is because it's not the book. It's you can't think of them as the same thing. They're both based very loosely on some sort of Cinderella story. And that is how you have to look at it. And yeah, who doesn't want to watch Anne Hathaway and giants dance to the song that I can't think of at the moment? But okay, all right, there's a couple people. That's fine. Fine. I will watch it all by myself and I will be happy. And I will belt along to it and be very, very happy to watch it in all of its ridiculousness. But it knows it's ridiculous, which is what makes it okay, because it knows that it's an absolute mockery and parody of everything that the genre and the book is. And I think that's what makes it okay. So Ella Enchanted, Gail Carson Levine, first time that I found a book that was my genre, that I learned that this is the genre that I want to read. So going off of that genre, the first time I discovered a series that I absolutely loved, and I just kind of dived into it and bought this series. Oh, this series, I have all of the books in, Kareen. This one I do, 1 to 12, I think, 1 to 13. And so this is the Everworld series by K.A. Applegate. And it is as well, it's a fantasy series. The books are quite, I think they're only like 200 pages of these tiny little like mass market paperback kind of 200-page books. And it's a series that I really want to reread at some point, but it's been so long since I've read them. But it's a story of this kind of group of friends. And the first one is called The Search for Senna. It involves a teen named Senna and her boyfriend who one day I think they're walking down the street and all of a sudden this kind of hole in the world opens up. She gets sucked into this hole. Her boyfriend has no idea what to do, how to save her. All that he can remember is her screaming as she kind of gets sucked into this hole. And so him and his friends start to figure out kind of what happened to her, where she went. And so this brings them into the world of Everworld, which is a fantasy world. And they have to go into this world and kind of navigate it and search for Senna and try and bring her back to the mortal world. And of course, there's way, way more going on than they think that there is. And Senna is way more than they think that she is. And she kind of has connections to that world that nobody knew about. But yeah, again, it was kind of that first time where I'm like, this is my genre. this is the genre that I want to keep reading. And because of the length of the series, I think it was my first experience, like I said, with a series. And so it really, I love series. I love a good fantasy series. I love to be able to kind of dive into the whole world in multiple books. And so again, that was kind of the first time that I was able to find something that had that through story. So not like the Sweet Valley Kids, where yes, each book was about the same people, but there wasn't sort of that through adventure and that through story that you had to keep following. And so I think that was the first time that I had found that. That is my formative years of reading. We are now going to move on to high school and university. And I debated whether or not to include these in my list because I don't know, it's a little bit strange, but it formed a lot of my reading. Most of my high school and university years were spent reading plays because I was a theater kid in high school. I was a big theater kid, and I continued to be a theater kid in college and university. And so most of what I had time to read was the things I was being asked to read, kind of similar to what you were saying, Virginia, things that you were kind of being asked to read for school. And in my case, that was a lot of plays, and it was a lot of classic plays. So a lot of Shakespeare, a lot of Greek theater. And I actually came to quite enjoy Shakespeare and Greek theater. And so I think that I do say that it does impact a lot of my reading. Most specifically, Macbeth by Shakespeare is one of my all-time favorite plays. I've seen it in multiple places on multiple stages with a castle as an actual backdrop for it and kind of various versions of it. And I will go back to it over and over and over again. I've done monologues from it. I can quote monologues from it. I can quote scenes from it. It has impacted a lot of when I was an actor, it impacted a lot of the work that I did as an actor. And so I think that I need to include Macbeth by Shakespeare on my list. And then on the other side of the classics, I enjoyed Shakespeare, but when I learned about Greek theater, when I learned about the Greek myths, I realized that I was much more of a Greek myth person than a Shakespeare person. And so I was very lucky in a lot of my classes to be able to do Greek instead of Shakespeare. So I think that I have to mention some of the Greek works that definitely through a lot of my university years were very, very impactful to my reading. It inspired me to find books and novels that kind of encompassed the Greek myths and retold the Greek myths. And I still look for that when I'm looking for books to read. I still love a good Greek myth retelling. And so, the Oresteia by Aeschylus, Trojan Women by Euripides, and Iphigenia or Iphigenia, or however you choose to pronounce the name. It is pronounced in a variety of different ways. Iphigenia at Aulis by Euripides, as well as Hesiod's Theogony, which is the history of the Greek gods. So I took a mythology class in university, a Greek mythology class, where I got to learn kind of all of the history of the Greek myths and where the Greek gods came from and all of their background. And so I have to mention those because they, as I said, they continue to impact the type of book that I really, really enjoy and the stories that I really like. The next play is one I'm including because me and my husband have connected quite a bit over it. And so this play is one that we both did at university. We both did scenes from it. We were not in the same class, so we did not do scenes together, but we just both happened to be cast in the play at various times through our university classes. And then when we were on our first trip to Ireland, we actually went to the town that this play takes place in. And we have really corny pictures of us holding up a copy of the play, standing in front of the sign of the town, where we actually asked the tour bus driver specifically if we could stop there. He said yes. He made the entire tour bus stop there so we could take pictures of the sign with the play held up. So the playwright Martin McDonagh is more commonly known for the movies that he is a part of. So 3 Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri. Is that the name of it? Oh my gosh. 7 Psychopaths, In Bruges. There might be one more, but those are the movies that are written and directed by Martin McDonagh. But a lot of people are not as familiar with his plays. So Martin McDonagh is a playwright. He's an Irish and British playwright. And he writes a lot of very dark, comedic kind of work that his plays at least focus a lot on life in Ireland, usually not very good life in Ireland, and kind of the struggles that people go through and what that means for them and how they become who they are because of those struggles. And so the one that both me and Tyler were in and that we went to the town of Lenon is The Beauty Queen of Lenon by Martin McDonagh. It was my most successful scene work that I have ever done in my university career. There was a lot that I struggled with in some of my acting classes, but that play, even my acting teacher said there was something about it that just worked for you. And so it was very impactful for my acting work, very impactful for what I wanted to read play wise. Both me and Tyler have kind of devoured all of the rest of his plays. And so we really, really enjoyed that. And then, I was able to connect with Tyler on that as well. Okay, 3 more to go. 3 more to go. Now, these ones are not going to be quite as shocking, surprising. I don't know if any of them have been that shocking, but these are the books that I read more as an adult. And so these are the ones that, again, once I kind of found my genre, were the stories and the books that were maybe the first books in that genre that I realized I really, really enjoyed and wanted to read more of. So again, not surprising. The first one is Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. A little bit of magic, lots of history, lots of romance, made me want to search out any books that kind of were similar to that genre. I remember my mom actually read it, and I remember seeing it like on the coffee table when she would read it, and I knew absolutely nothing about it. And now it kind of makes me laugh knowing that my mom read it, just because I don't think it is her kind of book at all. She's much more of a mystery reader, but that was kind of where I first learned about it. And I just devoured it. I devoured the series. I have not read the most recent one just because I actually just bought the audiobook, and Pillars of the Earth was 41 hours. This one is 49 hours. Yeah. So we're going to wait a little bit before we get into that one. But yes, again, just the first time that I kind of read a book like that I realized that that's what I wanted to read more of. So the next one, again, I have read everything that has been written, but I have kind of lost interest in the series, but it was the first one that got me into kind of more epic fantasies, and that is A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. I was a huge Game of Thrones reader. The reason I got into it is a bit strange. I was a huge Charmed fan when I was younger. I still am. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Big Charmed fan. And once I watched the entire series of that, I wanted to see what else the actors were in. And at one time, Holly Marie Combs, who played Piper in Charmed, was rumored to be cast as, oh my gosh, I can't even remember the character anymore, somebody in the Game of Thrones series. She did not end up being in the series. But when I was looking into it and learned that it was based on a book, I decided to read the book and absolutely loved it. So that's kind of how a weird way that I got into Game of Thrones. But again, it kind of got me into epic fantasy and made me want to read more. And one day, I'm sure I will go back to it if the book is ever released, and I might love it. It will probably be another 49-hour audiobook that I might listen to. Okay, I think we're at my last one. And again, I feel like I had to include this author. I've mentioned this author so many times on this podcast. This is the first book that I read by her. And again, it got me interested in urban fantasy as a genre and made me want to search out any other urban fantasy, as well as any book that she has ever written, which I think I've read most of them. So this is Bitten by Kelly Armstrong. So this is the first book that I read by Kelly Armstrong. Just kind of happened to pick it up one day and then devoured the 13-book series. I think that one, plus all of the novellas. There's about, 10 or 12 novellas that also go along with the series. And I've read all of them. And just kind of that first instance of urban fantasy that really impacted my love of that genre and wanting to look into it more. I think that's it. I think so. It's a lot. It's a lot.
Yes, and thank you for sharing. So now we know why you are such a devoted series reader. And I didn't know you like Game of Thrones. That's new to me.
It was one of the first books I gave 5 stars to.
Oh.
It was the first Game of Thrones book. Yeah. I don't know if it would still get 5 stars if I reread it, but at the time it did.
That's why we don't reread, right? Just in case. All right, Miss Corinne, tell us about your 10 books.
Yes. So thinking about my reading history, as my other book friends have kind of shared, I have always been a reader. So one of my fondest early childhood memories is kind of snuggling into my parents' bed with my 3 siblings and my dad reading us Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales and being like struck with like the pathos and the angst of it all. And so, yeah, I grew up a bookworm. I was a horribly shy child, teen, adult. And so books were my friends, books were my source of comfort. And so I've always been a reader as soon as I could kind of figure out and decipher those strange scribblings. For this particular list, I decided to kind of like go back to my roots as a reader of kind of like trying to find that thread of the books that I currently enjoy right now. Where did all of that start? And this is actually going to be bookended by 2 people who played kind of like a pivotal role in my life and my reading life, and they were both school librarians. So the first one, I believe I was in grade 2, and our school librarian was very old school and very strict. And so as a beginning reader, you had to go to a particular section with all of the readers and read through all of those. And then when you were chosen by the school librarian, she would separate you from the rest of the children and take you over to like the sacred chapter book section. And so one day she took 2 of my friends and I decided to just kind of like follow along because I wanted to read the chapter books too. I'm a good reader, gosh darn it. And so I followed and kind of creeped behind and just listened as she like chose a special book for them off the shelf and put it into their hands. These good readers, these excellent readers, these strong readers. And I kind of looked up and I was like, what about me? What about me? And she looked down at me with just pity and disdain. And she just kind of ushered me back to the reader area, took off an Amelia Bedelia book, put it in my hands and said, I think this is a better book for you. I was so furious and so angry and so insulted that I was like, I'll show you, Mrs. Elder, who I have taken this to this day, that fire, that anger, and that rage. And I went home and I like tearfully told my mom what happened. And she's like, it's okay. It's okay. I'm going to take you somewhere really special. And she took me to the public library and she took me into the kids area and said, here, you can take anything you want. I said, even the chapter books? Yes, take anything you want. And I struggled. I struggled, but that kind of like ember of fury has sustained me ever since. And it led me a kind of like a horrible incident of my childhood that I remember so vividly kind of led to something really wonderful and beautiful. So the first book on my list, I can't remember exactly which Amelia Bedelia book it was because I didn't read it because I was insulted. So yeah, I think that book, that series has been very pivotal for me as a reader. And the second book I did discover in the public library. My mom actually brought it for me when I was sick because all I wanted to do when I was sick was lie in bed and read. And she brought me this gigantic book, this huge, like coffee table sized book. And I remember reading it. And I think the only descriptor that I can get is like the same idea as like religious awe of this like changed my world. I looked up at these images and I felt something like primal and early human that I did not understand. And this is D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths. So if you have ever seen this book, the art in it is, I would argue, not for children. It's this weird melding of like French and ancient Greek style. And the images are just like, they're burned into my brain of these very strange myths illustrated in this way that is just, awe-inspiring. And so that book, I think, kind of, if I go back to my roots in interest in art and interest in kind of like Greek and mythology, that's the book that started all of that. Like Virginia, also roots as a children's librarian and also a fantasy reader when I feel like it. Loved Ella Enchanted. Sadie, you and I will have words about that movie later. But one of the books that I love so much that kind of takes the genre and looks at it with a little bit of tongue in cheek is Diana Wynne Jones' Howl's Moving Castle. I love that book, has such a firm place in my heart. I think Diana Wynne Jones was an amazing writer who really understood like the injustices of being a child. And this story is just so wonderful. Again, maybe a book that has absolutely nothing to do with the movie adaptation of it, but successful in its own way. But as a fantasy reader, that and kind of Ella Enchanted, those books really kind of make that genre for me. The fourth one is another one that I got from the public library that maybe I should not have. As listeners of the podcast know, I love true crime. And at a very impressionable age, I picked up the true crime Canadian book, Nothing Sacred, The Multiple Lives and Betrayals of Al Walker by Alan C. Cairns. If you are unfamiliar with Al Walker, he was a Canadian financier who lived in Ontario, who at a certain point just disappeared with $3 million. And then eventually killed a man, stole his identity, and married his daughter. Yeah, so that is, I remember this book in great detail because I read it very young and it changed my world. But it was also something that I had heard about in the news. And so again, it's that what I find interesting about true crime is trying to understand how and why. It's the psychology of people. And so I think that this book really, really delved into something that I had heard about in an in-depth way and kind of started that love of true crime so early, so very, very early. My other genre that I absolutely love, that I champion, is mystery. I love mysteries. I have always loved mysteries. I think that Murder, She Wrote is the most perfect television series ever created. And one of the mystery series, other than like obviously the Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and Trixie Belden and the Boxcar Children, and who's the nurse? There was a Cherry, what's her face? She was like a nurse who solved crimes, which like, honestly, when did she have the time for it? But one of the mystery series that I really loved, and I do have the 1st through 13 books and started with the first one, is the late great Egyptologist and all-around firecracker, Elizabeth Peters, who also goes by Barbara Michaels, who also has another name that she wrote her Egyptology books under. The first book in the, oh no, it's also Amelia. Oh, the Amelia Peabody series. Oh, that cuts a little too deep, is Crocodile on the Sandbank and the Amelia Peabody mysteries, which I loved. And I would like nothing better than to go around hitting people with a parasol and getting them to do what I want, while also solving crimes and doing archaeology, which I discovered later in university is maybe not as a lucrative career as it was back in Victorian England and requires so much crouching, just a tremendous amount of crouching, which I'm not very into. But that particular mystery series came at a very like pivotal time, and I think has kind of continued that I just love a good mystery, and she wrote in such a funny, wonderful way. All right, the next ones are kind of embarrassing, so I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to bite the bullet, and I'm just going to say that these books are important to me. The 6th one is the Wallflower series by Tomoko Hayakawa. I'm manga trash. I've always been manga trash. I'm proud of that fact. I'm not proud that this was probably the first series that I read. That and Absolute Boyfriend, they are not good, but I love them. I love them, and I thought they were great. This particular series is about a goth girl who has a lot of anatomical statues, I'm going to go with, that she's friends with, and she's very antisocial. And for reasons, capital R reasons, she ends up living in her mansion with 4 extremely hot guys who don't like to wear shirts. They may or may not be models. I'm a little fuzzy on the details, but I remember thinking, yeah, this is art. This is like prime storytelling. I think one of them might fall in love. I can't remember. All I remember is that every time she kind of sees him and he's really good looking, her nose like explodes with blood. And I was like, I understand that, I guess. Yeah, I love manga. I love graphic novels. And I'm not ashamed to say that that was kind of like my first series that I followed every volume that I got from the library in Edmonton that had a great manga selection. And here's where we are today. Okay. This is real bad. Okay, number 7 is The Evil Twin by Francine Pascal. I loved trashy YA stuff. I loved Fear Street. I loved the Christopher Pike myth, those as well. When you were talking, Sadie, about one of your books, I suddenly had like a thunderbolt moment of remembering how much Lurleen McDaniels I read, which is horrible. But The Evil Twin is part of the Sweet Valley High series, which again, pivotal in my life, which centers around 2 very, very perfect blonde twins who, and here's where it gets a little bit fuzzy. There's evil twins who are definitely not their actual twins, but look exactly like them, up to the point where they could just stroll into their house and their mother, father, and brother couldn't tell the difference between them, which says a lot about like the familial relationships of the Wakefields, that Margot was able to infiltrate them so easily. The best part about the evil twin, Margot, is that she has a secret other twin, Nora. And then Margot and Nora, I think at some point die, but then they also might come back. And then they try to like kill Jessica and Elizabeth and take over their perfect lives. And then one of them might die in a car wreck. And then one of them might also come back as a ghost and try to possess one of them. Also, I think at some point Elizabeth like dated a straight up werewolf, like just a werewolf. Yeah, so these were obviously like slice of life, deeply nuanced oeuvres of like the California Valley scene, which I liked. But I love trashy YA. I loved the series. I love them all. And The Evil Twin, I remember like the heart pounding, like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to them next? Is she really going to take over their entire lives? Are her parents not really going to notice that she's evil? Like, really? Really? No one has any questions of like, oh, why are you so like evil? No, apparently no one did. And it's very easy to take over someone else's life. The more you know. Oh, this is embarrassing. Okay. So yes, if I had to choose like The Evil Twin and all those, that's like my thriller roots. Okay. And now we're going to talk about romance. As we know, I love a good romance novel. And if I had to like search back to see where this like appreciation, this is really embarrassing, where the appreciation of this genre comes from, and I had to dig very deep for this, and because I'm amongst book friends, I'm willing to be vulnerable, is that my idea of romance, like true romance, of epic love, comes from the Star Trek Next Generation novel by Peter David Imzadi. Yeah, Peter David, who wrote many masterpieces in the Star Trek Next Generation genre, of which I have read all of them, including Q Squared, which I will probably admit that I cried to. I loved this epic love of these 2 Starfleet officers. It was both forbidden and it wasn't what her parents want. It was star-crossed and it was beautiful, but through every generation and every universe, they belonged together. This is compounded by the fact that I had actually never seen an episode of Star Trek Next Generation. I had never watched the TV show, and yet I read all of the books. And the love between Riker and what's her face? Counselor Troy, thank you. Counselor Troy. I know. And this is what I understand romance to be. That's what love is. Even though, didn't Troy marry Worf at some point? Yeah, so love means waiting sometimes for your girlfriend to marry someone else and then I think get amicably divorced. Yeah, but that's love. That's what love is. So yeah, every romantic blueprint that I have in my mind comes from that book. Yeah. The penultimate book, and because I have to give a shout out to one of my Janes, is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I love this book. It formed who I am. I remember going on vacation and someone was playing the A&E version of the Pride and Prejudice miniseries. And I was like, what's going on? Is this what this book is actually about? You mean it's just about people going for visits and then falling in love and then playing the piano forte? And it was. It's all about scandal and gossip and societal like commentary, but mostly about love. Yes. So this was the first kind of like classic book that I read in high school, and it blew my mind how fun it was. It kind of like opened my world into thinking like, oh, like just because it's classic, just because it's old, just because it's not written by R.L. Stine doesn't mean it can't be interesting. And kind of my love of this book led me to Jane Eyre, which is one of my favorite books of all time, to kind of look at history, which I think led to my very useful degree in history, my bachelor's degree in history. So I blame Jane for a lot of things, a lot of things, that being one of them. And then on a more like serious, heartfelt note, as I said, this was going to be bookended by two school librarians, one of whom spurred me to become the reader that I am today, and the other did as well, but in a different way. So my middle school, high school librarian was Laura Glore, and she was a wonderful, supportive, worldly deep thinker in the way that I had never kind of encountered before. And she knew that I liked reading. I was reading Pride and Prejudice, obviously Imzadi, deep thinker. But the book that she put into my hands that I think kind of changed me into the reader that I am today is Women of the Silk by Gail Tsukiyama. So a lot of my reading, as Virginia had kind of said, very dead and or very white. And this book, which is kind of like a bit of historical fiction, which I had never read before, which is literary fiction, which I hadn't read before, which is about a time and place that I hadn't lived in, it kind of blew my world wide open. In that this was a story that I had never heard before, told in a way that I had never read before or encountered. And I think all of us kind of have that moment when we realize that our own interior world, that our own experience is not universal, and that part of being human is as much as you can to try and understand other perspective and other points of view and do that own introspection to better understand the world. And this was the book that kind of started that journey for me of trying to read more diversely and try to understand like the bigger picture of the world, and that there are so many stories out there that if you don't make an effort to do it, you'll never encounter, and you'll never kind of experience the pleasures and wonders and mastery of other places and other people. So I would like to thank Laura Glore, which I do for a lot of things because she was a wonderful, wonderful influence on my life, for putting that book into my hands and kind of opening up my world beyond the extremely small, extremely sheltered small town that I grew up in. I think without this book and without her influence, I wouldn't be where I am today. And my world would be so much smaller. So yeah, those are my 10. I think that these are the books that kind of like started me off on the reading pathways, whether it be a kind of interest in art, fantasy, true crime, mystery, manga, thrillers, romance, and the classics and literary fiction. I think that kind of like boils me down to my essence.
All right. Well, thank you, Miss Corinne. I'm so glad you met a better school librarian. After that, I am glad. All right. Well, last but not least, we have Elle. And I know, Elle, when you first started your first episode, you gave us 10 books and then we read some of that. So I don't know if your list is the same as last time, but it's going to be so much better listening to you talk about them than us talking about your books. So Elle, please share with us your 10 books.
All right. So I decided to try and pick books that I had not talked about yet or that had not been talked about yet. So these are all 10 books that I think shaped me as a reader. Like Corinne, I was a reader since I was very young. I have been always someone who really loved reading and books. And so the books that I have chosen today are 10 that are at the roots of things that I still love and that sort of stuck with me for some reason. So the first one involves a young boy who lives on a planet far, far away, a very small planet where he grows a tiny rose that he falls in love with. And then he falls to Earth in search of more things for his rose. And that is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. This book blew my mind as a small child, especially the opening part where the narrator explains how children see the world differently from adults, where he drew a snake eating an elephant, but the adults could only see a hat. But the little prince and children could see immediately that there is an elephant inside that snake. And just this description of the different perspectives, the beautiful storytelling, the way that the little prince is bitten by the snake at the end and returns to his star, and the grief that the narrator feels, but the happiness for having met him. It's poignant, it's beautiful, and it's stuck with me since I was very young. I still have a copy at home, and I pull it out from time to time. Now, next was a book that I don't know if I should have read as a child, but I picked up because my parents had it lying around the house. This book is a little difficult to describe, but the easiest way to describe it is as a series of letters between an artist and a woman who becomes his muse. This book kindled my interest in books as physical objects and books as things that can do things other than just have print on a page. This book is Griffin and Sabine by Nick Bantock. And the thing that was so interesting to me was that this wasn't just words on a page. This was little letters that you could pull out from their envelopes. There were postcards. There were different handwritings. It was a beautiful book and just a really interesting piece of art. And I read all of them. There's, I think, 5 in the series. And definitely some things that flew over my head as a child. Definitely some things that maybe were a bit more adult than I should have come into contact with at that tender age. But this love of books as physical objects, this love of books that do something different with their printing, whether that be something like House of Leaves, where the text is an artifact that lets you read from multiple perspectives at once. Things like S, where you've got text and physical objects interspersed within the book. It just really opened my eyes to how books could be something other than just words on a page. And I will always be grateful for Griffin and Sabine for doing that for me. The next book that I want to talk about is one that is probably one of the most well-known on my list. It is the story of a hobbit who inherits a magic ring from his adoptive uncle and goes on a grueling journey to destroy it. It's The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I first read this book when I was 9 years old. This is not a book that generally would fall into the hands of a 9-year-old, but I was one of those kids who the parents would take me to the library and say, "Go, be free." And I would pick things up. And this was around the time when the movie was coming out. And I thought, this movie looks interesting, but I would like to read the book. So I picked up The Lord of the Rings and I was immediately in love. This book kindled my love of epic fantasy. It kindled my love of writing. I remember reading the appendices in the back of Return of the King and finding the Elvish language, finding information about the world as it was written by Tolkien, like extra information that's not in the books, finding all of this work that had been put into creating this world. And it made me think, I want to create worlds like this. I want to become the kind of person who can put words on a page and conjure a whole world. And so I have credited Tolkien for a long time with my love both of reading and of writing, and I will never be able to thank Tolkien enough for that. The next book on my list is by an author named Robert C. O'Brien. Now, the books that Robert C. O'Brien is most well known for would probably be The Secret of NIMH or Z for Zachariah. But the book that I picked up, the book that I found at the library, was one of his less well-known ones, The Silver Crown. The Silver Crown is a book that has stuck with me since I was very young because it is just a very... If you know The Secret of NIMH, if you know Z for Zachariah, you know that Robert C. O'Brien is not an author who thinks that children need to be coddled. He is very good at writing books that will affect you and will probably scare you. And this book starts off with a young girl's house burning down after she gets a strange silver crown for her birthday. It just appears on her nightstand and she's like, well, it's my birthday. This must be a present for me. So she takes the crown, goes to school, comes home, and her house is burning down. And she realizes that something, like, people are looking for this crown, people are looking for her, and she runs off and gets into a series of strange adventures. And hoo boy, is this a dark book. I loved it. I read this book and I immediately went, this is what I want more of. This is something that I need more of in my life. I want to read books that affect me like this, that scare me a little bit, that take me to places that I could never have imagined on my own. So that's The Silver Crown by Robert C. O'Brien. Highly recommend. I occasionally try to recommend it to kids, but I think it's out of print, unfortunately, so it's hard to find. The next book, I'm sorry, Corinne, this is not the first book in a series. This is the second book in a series. I did start with the first book, but the one that has stuck with me has been the second book, and it is Deep Wizardry by Diane Duane, the second book in the So You Want to Be a Wizard series, the Young Wizards books. And this book, again, deals with danger, it deals with trauma, it deals with death, and it just was so formative for me to read this book and to come to understand that these are topics that you can address in stories and that you can come to understand things better through reading them. Now, the next book that I have on my list is a little embarrassing. I have a love of trashy vampire books. We'll just say that. Trashy vampire books get me. And I think the first book that I ever read that was in this sort of genre was The Silver Kiss by Annette Curtis Klaus. Yeah, it's a bit of a deep cut. I don't remember all that much about this book, but I remember how it made me feel. And how it made me feel was, I want more of this. I hadn't read much in the way of romance. I was a young teenager, and I read this, and it was just like, oh, there are stories like this out there? I devoured other books by Annette Curtis Klaus. I read Blood and Chocolate, which was made into a horrible movie. I did not like the movie.
Oh, both with Hugh Dancy. Both with Hugh Dancy. He was in the horrible Ella Enchanted and the horrible Blood and Chocolate.
Really? But these books opened me up to the world of paranormal romance. And I have been a somewhat embarrassed fan of the genre ever since. Books that are kind of trashy and about vampires are my guilty pleasure. One of them would be Guilty Pleasures by, oh gosh, it's the Anita Blake series. I like the first few books in that series. After a while, it gets a bit too raunchy for me. But the first few books in that series are great, and I love them. I also love the Vampire Hunter D series by Hideki Kikuchi. And they are not romance, but definitely very trashy vampire books. So the thing that got me into trashy vampire books, which I will always be happy for, is The Silver Kiss by Annette Curtis Klaus. Now, like Corinne, I am a big fan of manga. And the first manga I can remember really grabbing me and really like pulling me in really getting me into the genre because I had been watching anime for a little bit, but I hadn't gotten into manga at first. But the story that really grabbed me was Fullmetal Alchemist by Hiromu Arakawa, a classic of the genre, still one of my favorite manga I've ever read. It is a story about tragedy and betrayal and grief. It is also a story about very silly things. And the balance of humor and drama and just the wonderful human story that it tells have stayed with me ever since. Now, we're getting close to the end of my list. One of the things you might have noticed about me in my short term here on the podcast is that I really like sci-fi, and nothing sci-fi has come up on my list yet. That's because I didn't come into reading sci-fi until probably later in life. I watched sci-fi. I watched Doctor Who. Stargate was one of my favorite shows growing up. Yeah. Science fiction television had been on my radar, but books, not so much. But growing up, our family would always go visit my grandparents' cabin out at Riding Mountain National Park, and there is a used bookstore there called Poor Michael's, where we would always make a bit of a pilgrimage. We would drop off some of our books that we no longer needed. We would get store credit, and we would be set free within the store to pick up whatever we wanted. And I picked up the first couple books of a series by Lois McMaster Bujold called the Vorkosigan Saga. So this is The Warrior's Apprentice by Lois McMaster Bujold. And this series follows Miles Vorkosigan, who is a young disabled man from a culture that is very much a warrior culture. They don't believe that disabled children should even really be allowed to live. So the fact that Miles has made it as far as he has is partly due to his own grit and determination, partly due to his intelligence, and partly due to the love of his parents who refused to sacrifice him, even though he was born with a disability. And the stories of Miles Vorkosigan are always about his guile overcoming all sorts of problems and challenges, and I loved them. These stories introduced me to the space opera genre, which is still one of my favorites, and they're a very long series that I have gotten to love. Like Sadie, I'm a bit of a series reader, so this is one of those series that I have come to love and still love because there are books in the series even now coming out, I believe. Most recently was Gentleman Joel and the Red Queen back in 2016, somewhere around there. But it's a very good series, highly recommend, and got me into reading science fiction. My second to last book is a book that got me interested in short stories, a book that caught my interest through an anime first, and then I decided I needed to read the book based on that the anime was based on. This book is different from the rest of the books on my list in that I don't think the series has ever been translated into English. The first book was translated and then none of the rest of them were. And I've heard that the first book's translation was not very good. But if you can read Japanese and you have the ability to get a hold of it, I highly recommend the series Kino's Journey or Kino no Tabi, The Beautiful World. This is a series of stories about a young person named Kino who rides on their talking motorcycle, Hermes, and they travel from town to town, from country to country, and stay for no more than 3 days to get an idea of what's going on and what is going on in the world in this place before moving on. So Kino never stays in a place longer than 3 days, but those 3 days are enough to learn about a place and to take the measure of the people there. And the series subtitle, The Beautiful World, is from a quote at the beginning of the first book, which is, "The world is not beautiful, and yet it is." This is a series of stories about how humans can be terrible to each other and about how bad things can happen and yet the world can still be a beautiful place. And I really love the hope that these stories carry. I really love the way that they make me feel. I think the writing is beautiful. And it's also one of the first books that I was able to read all by myself in Japanese, which is a sense of accomplishment for me. So if you can read Japanese, if you're trying to learn Japanese and you want something to practice on, these are great books because you can read one short story and feel a lot of accomplishment and then move on to the next and the next and the next and slowly work your way through the books. There's 22 books in the series, so you will have a lot to work through, but it's worth it. Highly recommend. And the final book that I'm going to talk about is one that came into my life relatively recently, but it sort of kickstarted my love of poetry. Because for a lot of my life, I had studied poetry in university and in high school, but I'd never really understood what drew people to it. I was interested in sort of breaking it down in an academic sense, but I had never read poetry and gone, this is something that I want to read a whole book of. But then, and I can't even remember how this book came into my hands, but I acquired Crush by Richard Saikin, and it gutted me in the best way possible. It's a slim collection of poems. It's not a big book, but each poem is like a kick to the gut. They're beautiful, they are raw, and they're a portrait of love and loss and so many emotions. Just so many emotions. This poetry collection will make you feel all things. And it really drove home to me why people read poetry. And I've, as a result, started to read more poetry. But this collection will always have a special place in my heart and a special place on my bookshelf. So a little disconnected perhaps, but that would be my 10 books that have influenced me as a reader.
Thank you so much, Al, for sharing. I love hearing about the guilty pleasures and all the other things that, is on your list. That is great. And everybody else too, I think everybody was like, Corinne said a little, I'm willing to be a little more vulnerable today and review stuff that, we might not want to ever attach to our names. And even just as I was listening to everybody talking, I'm just like, oh yeah, that book, that should have on my list. There's so many more books. I think we have to pick 10, but there's so many more. I think that has made a difference in our lives. So thank you to all the authors, all the books out there. And I love how a lot of books sort of ended up on our radar, sort of like by serendipity. Like we had like Elsa, I don't remember why I found this book, how I got into this, but it was great. So yeah, thank you so much. I love this episode. To get to know every one of you so much more. And I guess we look forward to another 150 and more. So yeah, thank you listeners, for spending the time with us. We are so happy that you're here and we are looking forward to talking about more books next week. So thank you again and we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please tell a fellow book lover about it. You can find a list of all the books we discussed in our show notes. Join us next week for another fun book chat. Until then, keep it fictional.